Okay. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're on the tail end of a busy holiday season. New Year's just a couple days ago. So I just really appreciate those of you that have taken the time to join us today. And I'm really looking forward to sort of I don't want to call it a final wrap up, because I'm sure this won't be the last time that we'll partner with Kevin and Liz. I just want to thank them directly right now for the things that they've shared with us, and hoping that the ideas and the frameworks and suggestions that they've offered to us are things that we all can work on collaboratively and together in our county. And I just want to thank them for the work that they're doing. And with that, I'll just uh, turn it over to them, and we'll enjoy this last training session with them for this time.
Well, thank you so much. Good to be with you. Um, I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season. Um, and um, and we're I think we're ready to get back to work. How about you, Liz?
Yes.
Yeah. There's only takes so much. But anyway, we'll start. Megan resent to us two questions that came up from following the last session, which I think the first one fits really well with the direction Liz and I were hoping to go in today. So I'll read the first one. The person, um, has a particular perspective. They've said, how can we change or address systems that are separating families unnecessarily? How do we address the issues regarding separation of families, um, where there may be unprofessional workers or people with a strong bias? Um, Yeah, you kind of get the point. The reason I think that's relatable to the conversation we want to have is not having to do with unprofessionalism, but it has to do with something we learned. I'll remind you, and I think I've mentioned before. Um, uh, One of the things that people in the child welfare world might know me best for is my research around something that became known as family finding, which is not something that I named it. It was a person called it that, and that it kind of stuck. But it was what we were doing. What the research was in response to what I was hearing in my work over 20 years ago, and maybe some of you could relate to this even now. When someone about speaking about a young person in out-of-home care in the child welfare system or a juvenile justice system would say, "This kid's got nobody." And that would begin their introduction. I was among other things, a foster parent, so they're calling me about a teenager, and one of the first things they're saying to compel me as a foster parent to say yes is to say that's kind of a message to me about why I was important for the young person, right? This kid has no one, they need a family to live with, and that was something I heard a lot, especially working with complex presenting older young people. And I ended up doing a research project around that question. Is it really true that the longest waiting young people in the American out-of-home care system have no family? And I spent about a decade doing that. We looked at 50,000 young people across 40 states and one Canadian province. And of course, it largely turned out to be untrue. 94%, in fact, of the young people in those projects, and this is how I met Elizabeth as well in Philadelphia at the time. Not only did we find an average of between 100 and 300 living relatives conservatively, we also even found that family members who didn't know they existed until we contacted them, um, that 5 to 8 of them, um, according to Child Trends, who contributed to that evaluation, Trends reported that 5 to 8 of those relatives said they wanted a relationship of significance for a lifetime with those young people, even if they were in jail, a prison, a hospital, or a residential program, and were had very complex situations. People still from their families wanted and desired a relationship with them, um, and so that was the research. This question, what's relatable to the question is, have along the way, this thing called family finding ended up becoming part of legislation in the Congress. And in 2008, in the Fostering Connections bill, the search for relatives and providing them formal notice in writing that a family member of theirs was in the custody of the government became mandated in the United States for every child entering the foster care system and any child who was at imminent risk of entering the foster care system. So in the process then of the implementation of that new mandate in federal law in the states, we found there was a problem. And the problem we encountered is really what I think this person's getting at is something we've had different narratives for, but the one that stuck for me was that I might have mentioned to you guys before was Isabella Wilkerson wrote a book that she won a Pulitzer Prize for called The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's a book about the Great Migration of about 6 million African American uh, people fleeing murderous and oppressive conditions in Jim Crow in the Jim Crow South, and they're leaving the South and coming supposedly being invited to come to places like Minneapolis, Seattle, other north and western cities to Detroit being a big one, to presumably being promised the opportunity of being welcomed um, into manufacturing jobs that would have really improved their economic circumstances. As it turned out, and that's what Wilkerson's book is about. Those jobs weren't in fact forthcoming. They were being used to break the labor movement. They weren't really welcome, and so the term she used to describe the experience of African Americans in those decades was what she called invited but unwelcome. And what we saw in the implementation of family finding in the mandate was an invited but unwelcome experience. We could find 100 to 300 relatives. 5 to 8 of them would say they desperately wanted a relationship with that young person. But what we did not do was change the fundamental practice of a system that thinks of itself existing around child protection and the idea that foster parents are better, safer, that kids need institutional placements, that children need residential care, all these deeply embedded ideas that were funded in decades of basically implementing entitlement programs like Medi-Cal, Medicaid, um, Title 4B, Title 4E funding in child welfare. We nothing about the mandate cha had done anything about these conditions, and it created a clash between a workforce that had been funded to do something very different, which was to keep children away from their families, and a bill that said, in alignment with the U.S. Constitution, that children shouldn't be in foster care except as the last alternative rather than the first one. And it created a conflict. And what that brought up for me in 2015 was a need to revisit the original model that I had developed for that research and correct errors in it that I felt responsible as an author for it doing harm to people because to invite grandparents and aunties and uncles and brothers and sisters to or believe they had been invited to meaningfully come to the table and finally have the opportunity to have access to a family member in the care of the government, only to be found that they were not welcome, imposed a whole new kind of trauma on people. And not only on families, but on the workers themselves. Many people called family finders who like Elizabeth's team, um, they were on one hand asked by the city of Philadelphia and the county to bring those family members forward, and then they were found that themselves then the family members knew Elizabeth and her team as the people that had contacted them, that had invited them, who were, authentically inviting them into a process, and yet they weren't in fact welcome. And my experience, certainly I had some too, where then relatives are calling you later and saying, well, why did you invite us if nobody really wanted us there? We were treated poorly, no one called us back. We were disrespected, discriminated against. I had to do something with that. And so I did a model revision in 2018. I'm sorry, 2015, called Family Finding Model Revision 1. And the first thing in the model revision was to implement what we called an alignment tool. And that's where we want to start today is this because it relates to the second question. It says, I've been so shocked by the historical context of our welfare system and inspired by the stories and framework you have shared. I'm just feeling overwhelmed about where to start, how to keep the inspiration going. And I really think this is exactly the place to start. I think it's not what we said about alignment was don't start your practice by engaging the family. Start your practice by engaging with your colleagues and your partners. So if you think about and while I'm talking about this as a in the context of child welfare, it is not for child welfare alone. I think any nearly and please, there may be folks here who won't be able to relate to this, but I suspect the majority of you can relate to this, is that many families who we work with, whether we're working in a housing program or for a tribe or a county agency around economic assistance, public health, the clients we meet with are in all likelihood also in relationship with other programs in the county or in the city. You're probably not the only social welfare helper who's connected to them. And by the way, a very powerful participant for some people and families will be the legal system's involvement with them. So whether that's legally involved through child welfare or legally involved through probation department or parole, um, in a prosecution process where the outcome's uncertain yet, people may be involved with other programs. And the alignment work is about not only recognizing that it's important that you have come to clarity about what you believe in your practice with people, but being sensitive to the fact that you may not be the only person who holds influence or power over another person whom you're working with. We saw this especially again for people who were family finders. You you had permission to do certain things, but you didn't have permission to be the final decider. And so the alignment notion was don't go searching for and engaging people into child and family teams, as we would call them in your context, without first facilitating a conversation with partners in your community who may also be connected to the family or person, and having a collective conversation about alignment. Can we work to align and come to a shared perspective about how this is different than I was thinking in 2015. It's evolved since then, but I'll use a different word here. Really, a more plain word I'm talking about is how are we going to use our individual and collective power over or potentially over the person that we're working with as a therapist, for example, or as a housing person or a child protection professional or a mental health clinician or probation officer. You have a tribal representative. You potentially have there's a difference in your power, and one has to think very deeply about how am I actually using my power with people. And so it sets the stage here. We recognize that if you don't take some time and actually think through the question we ask when I was visiting with you in person, we did a formulation exercise. What is the formulation question? What are we ultimately trying to ask? We would say it this way: what is the intervention anyway? What is the intervention anyway? Don't just start delivering services to people. Don't just start doing tick box intakes with people. You need to be contextualizing what you're doing. What is it that would actually be helpful here? Again, we talked about this when I visited about the perspective about needs and services to organized systems, which is the systems that we operate around the world. And certainly in California, the idea is that we seek to see what people need. Remember the definition of a need, things people do not have. And the second thing is that once we've made a list of the things people do not have, we then look at the services or programs that we have access to and we try to direct them toward that program. You can understand that this brings up problems. What we learn from people is that they recognize that very quickly in a needs and services design system, they are no longer seen as people. They become objectified. They're objects. They're objects of an agency's ability to deliver the services that you're funded to deliver. They're no longer fully capable humans, actors and authors and architects of their own lives. They're now recipients of what it is that your business sells. That is dehumanizing, even if it's not your intention. It's what happens. How do you not do that in a needs and services design system? You ask the question, you think it through. What is the intervention anyway? The idea here is that helping people is complex, fraught business, and that too often in our history, that in our efforts to help people, we've done things that are harmful. And that harmful bit is where we don't actually center what the person is saying they need, what the family is saying that they need. We are looking instead at our assessment or an assessment by someone else and what services are the best fit for what we're doing here. So the alignment tool is a way to try to get to something, and I'll finish here. Um, I don't know why I have a short list of people who I have a habit of blocking their names whenever I want to talk about them, but Mark Courtney, who is in California now, but Courtney had been at Chapin Hall for many years. Briefly, 5 or 6 years was here at the University of Washington, where I live. Um, and Courtney's one of the most respected child welfare researchers on the planet. And some years ago, Courtney did some work trying to learn something about family finding. He invited about 10 nonprofit and government agencies that were implementing family finding to come to Chicago and meet with him and his team over 3 days and do some where they could learn from them as researchers. And then subsequently, they produced a report talking about what they thought they learned from this cohort of implementers. And interestingly, the title of the paper included the word authentic family engagement. And what Courtney and his team was saying was the most important thing they learned from these 10 organizations that had done decades of implementation of what we now talk about as kin first work, um, that the single most important factor that predicted whether there was a positive experience or a not positive experience was the degree to which professionals practiced an authentic approach to the engagement and the participation of the family in the process. Not that they said that they did child and family team meetings, not that they said that they had invited people or they said that they had done family finding. None of those things predicted a positive outcome. It was the degree to which the experience from the family's perspective was authentic. What did the family say about how their power operated in this process or did not operate? And that gets to don't the old saying in healthcare, I'm sure you're familiar with for medicine, is do no harm. In social work, it's don't make it worse. Um, and the way to make it worse is just to come at people delivering the services the way you always do without really seeing people in front of you and their unique circumstances and capabilities, not just their needs and their services that you have to sell. Um, you have to, so the alignment work is an effort to make a determination, not just individually, but collectively. How how able do we feel, or sometimes do I and my organization feel that I am to being able to make an authentic commitment to a family-driven process here. And we created a series of questions to do that with. Liz, are we able to share the slide for that?
Says it's thinking.
And Megan,
Megan, you may need to allow participants to share, or you can make me a host.
there you go.
There we go. Thank you, Megan. Let me know if you can see this, everyone.
There we go. So we've made a list of questions here, five of them, and we'll just sort of go through them. The first thing we ask people to do together, and we would recommend sitting together or doing a Zoom conversation with other partners who are also engaged with the family, is collectively see if we in fact remember if you were part of the in-person time I spent, we did something called a a mindful positioning exercise where you did some drawing and looked at the questions that we've been at. And that first one, the needs, again, things people do not have, and what are the concerns. The first thing we have to deal with is, do we have a problem with what we call meta conflict? Meta conflict is a conflict about what the conflict is. So why is your agency there versus why is the other agency there versus why is another agency there versus why is there a volunteer like a court-appointed special advocate there? We cannot assume that when there are multiple systems interacting with the family, that everyone's there for the same reasons. They or believe in the same problems or see the same opportunities. If we ignore that meta conflict, what we're likely to do collectively is make life much harder for the individual, for the family. So, what are the collective, our shared perspectives from our different organizations and funding streams? What are, can we articulate what we think the needs are, the things people do not have, which is what we're organized around. And if there are concerns, particularly around people's health and particularly around people's safety and well-being, what are those things? Let's make a list of these things and be clear-headed together about what we think we're doing here. Then let's be intentional, number two, about establishing a purpose and a shared set of goals for working together. Now, I mentioned when we talk to you folks, we use the word child and family teams. And of course, that language comes from individualized and tailored care or wraparound. Wraparound, it was intended to be a planning process for people involved with multiple systems, the very thing we're talking about here. It's not intended to be a way to organize delivering services to people, but that is what it often becomes. What what do we think or what can we agree is our collective purpose, and what concerns, if any, do we can we do we have a consensus about? Is it housing? Um, is are there safety worries? What are the purpose and uh, the the purpose and goals then around these things that we've talked about as needs and concerns? Um,
Can I add something, Kevin, about the
sure.
concerns piece?
Yeah.
Because I suspect this came up when you were in person together, but we often pull ideas from lots of different places. One of the places we pull from is narrative therapy, and there's
Hmm.
a particular piece of language in the sort of articles of storytelling rights. So, whose meeting is this? Whose child is this? Whose process is this? And it's really simple language, and the language is the person is not the problem is the problem. And we cite that all the time in lots of different contexts. But as we're thinking about alignment here, I think it's really important to maybe just acknowledge something aloud together, which is when you are potentially working through some version of what's on the screen here as an alignment process with colleagues, with a family, a network, a community. One of the first things that, in my experience doing that, can happen is that the alignment that may happen is that a large group of people agrees that mom is the problem. If she would just, is the language I hear, right? If this person would just blank, I see Maria, I see you nodding. If this kid could just, level down at their residential, then they can go home. But it's they're the problem, this person. And so one of the things that I try to think about when we're in a facilitation role or when we're talking to wise folks like you is to just remember that language from the storytelling rights. The person is not the problem. The problem is the problem. So when we're together aligning around what are some of the in common concerns or worries that we might have, be really clear that we're not going to create language. Megan, I'm looking at you. So if Megan would just is our concern. Okay, thank you, family. That's a great start. Let's try again. What's actually underneath that? And what made me think of it, Kevin, is when you were listing, you said things like housing, system barrier, whatever they may be. But I find more often than not, just as humans, we tend to pick a person as the representation of the problem rather than the actual problem.
Yeah,
And
I absolutely
writing,
agree with I
yeah.
absolutely agree with you. And I want to add a layer to it, which is whatever we may be doing in our practice, and this is why the alignment is so important. Most of us still work in systems that are organized around deficits, all coming at this because of what people do not have. And what we're trying to expose in the alignment exercise is how much of that is happening here. How do we negotiate between the fact that Liz, we talk about this all the time, holding two truths. With the reality is we got to hold at least two truths. The truth is we still have systems that are very uh, deficit based, very problem focused. And as you point out, Liz, we tend to confuse the problem as the person.
Mhm.
Those are the systems we still operate with. In fact, we don't get paid unless we document this. Um,
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna my and the second part. Hold on, my wife's. I've got to run here in a second to take my dog in.
Okay.
Um, so we need to understand how much of that's operating, and really the question is, how do holding two truths? I know I work in deficit-driven systems. They haven't changed as much as we'd like them to change, but I also know that that I have a lot of ability to influence how that happens to people, right? Or and how we do this to people. And we're trying to work out both. And that's where this third one comes up. It gets to scaling, right? Because if you look at those first two, they're very deficit based because our systems are very deficit based. How much of that is playing out in this group of people? And where does it leave us? And that gets to this Likert scale idea, this scaling. If you've done safety organized practice, you might be familiar with scaling in California. The scaling of I like to use 0 to 10. 0 is I absolutely cannot make a commitment to authentically work with support and collaborate with this person or family. I just it's not possible for me to do that. There's something here that prevents me from this. Maybe it's family violence, maybe it's an out of control addiction. There may be maybe it's violence towards my colleagues from this person, whatever it might be. And a 10 would be the opposite end of that. I am authentically and absolutely committed and able to work in support of this person unconditionally in our collaboration towards achieving the goals that the family has. We're simply asking not only individually, where are you at? We're asking you collectively, where are you at? And our experience is if you collectively are 6 or higher, then we're going to move forward. We're going to go ahead and build this CFT and we're going to fully and authentically commit to that process. If you are lower than a 6, don't do that. Instead, stay in the conversation about what would it take to get from a 3 to a 6. If it's violence being a good example of this, what would it take for me or my agency to address the practical, realistic concerns that we have about our safety or the safety of another person in this situation, such that we could get to a higher level of authenticity around our ability to work here. It's just that's where we're making, Liz, to the point you were making it. That's where we're making the transforming our approach from recognizing we work for deficit-based systems that are changing slower than we'd all like. Let's keep in mind we've made a lot of progress, but there's more progress to be made to how do we build it? We do something called bridges. How do we build a bridge from that way that our systems operate to an ability that we have collectively to manage the way we use our power in support of this person? Um, I don't know if that's making sense. So, um, and that's why that next question, that how authentic can you be? What would, if this, I like this as a different way of asking this question that comes out of wraparound, I think, but in my experience, but, um, looking into the future, if things were going well, and that might respond to, let's use housing and family well-being as two primary focuses for support. If it's 1 year from now and things are going really, really well, and this family is stably housed, and they have the process and resources in place for the basics of life, and they're feeling good about list the things they might think were important to be going really well. Um, that's a way to answer the question, what's your authentic hope? In a year, there's going to be in housing. People are going to have the arrangements for the basics of life into the future. People in the family are going to be feeling good about the direction that their life is going in. That gives us some clarity about what we're here to do. Um, if that makes sense to you. You can then get into particulars here. You could be talking particularly about a child. They have friendships, they're in school, they feel included in the community, they feel safe at home. Um, the family's feeling hopeful about their future, they're sleeping well, their diet is better, they're feeling like life is good and worth living. You see what we're doing. We're coming right at this is what we call saying goodbye while you're saying hello. You're setting the conditions for how we're going to leave. How would we know if we've collectively done work here that would be valued by this family, valued by the community, valued by constituents, valued in our own agencies, that we feel proud of and is consistent with our ethical responsibilities as a social worker or as a clinician or as a case manager. Do you see the transformation that we're making here? We're holding both truths. We're squaring up to the deficit-based systems that we have, and we're trying to build a bridge from the system we have to the practice that we want to be a part of, if that makes sense. We don't do anything with people without first having confronted this set of questions together. How could we know that we are really doing the work that we came here to do? Elizabeth, I'm going to hand it back to you so I can run my errand, and I'll be right back. I just need to do this. Nicole, I told Nicole I would take care of this. I'll be right back. Thank you.
Oh, good. Thanks.
And I'm thinking bridges, but
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe both. We'll see if we have time for both. I know folks like to have practical tools in your hands whenever possible. So I want to just add one piece to what Kevin's shared here that I think will be valuable to folks, which is one of the things that's incredibly valuable in my original practice work around alignment, is that it's the step that we most often skipped, because there was an assumption, particularly I'm thinking about the question that one of you asked, in the professional connections, that we all agree. Right? When I started my work running the family finding program in Philadelphia County, the largest one in the United States for a long time, I made an assumption incorrectly that everybody that was also working with these same families was going to agree with what we were doing. That it was grandparents and parents who were making these decisions, that those folks had a right to come together in a room. It didn't take me very long to figure out I had missed something important, which is we've skipped a step because we don't all agree about that. And if we don't all agree about that, what do we do? And I think that is I think it was the first of the two questions that I put in the chat here. How do we change or address systems that are separating families unnecessarily, as one example? How do we address or change the reality that some of the folks that we're working with may not be aligned with us? And so I wonder, Megan, I'm going to lean on you for just a second here, and I wonder if it would be valuable to try and simulate this so that we can actually practice it. Does that sound okay? I know folks have cameras off because some of you have internet woes, but I know all of you are here. So what I think would be valuable would be to ask somebody, if the person who asked this question is here, you can jump on in. Give me a recent example that you could now look back and identify as a misalignment moment. So if nobody's got one, I've got about 1,000, but let me just ask. Does somebody have a recent example? You're engaging in a conversation about your practice, work you're doing with a family, a group of people, whoever, and immediately your spidey senses are alerting you to something you would now call misalignment, meaning there's disagreement amongst all the folks who hold power or are making decisions with this family or maybe within this family. Go ahead, Bonnie. I see you came on your camera. Maybe you have a thought.
Bonnie just is barely joining us, so.
All right, just joining. Thank you.
All right, welcome, Bonnie. Anybody got one? You can pop it in the chat too if your internet is not strong enough to. Okay, let's do a show of hands if you've ever had this happen. You are doing work, decision making about a family, group of people, young person, whatever the situation may be. And there is a disagreement or misalignment about which people in that family are safe or unsafe. Put your virtual or your real hand up if you've ever had that happen to you at work. I think this parent is great, super wonderful, safe. They should go home. Somebody else in that professional group thinks absolutely not. That's never happening. Few of us. Yeah. Let me give a specific example. I did, so when I started in Philadelphia County, I got recruited because of the work I had done in my research in school. And my research was about the effects of loneliness on particular groups of people, namely children in care. And so as I was being recruited into this program, the main interest for me was that I spoke 1.5 languages, which they said, oh, that's enough. You don't need to speak a whole nother language. We're just going to say you do. And we're going to use that because we're going to define your position as the specialist around international failed adoption cases. So I'm 21, almost 22 years old, and I'm in charge of all of the failed adoptions for international young people in Philadelphia County. So that's children from Central and South America, Southeast Asia, and Western Africa during that time in our history. A little bit different now, but I'm going to be in charge of that. So these are kids who've been either adopted or, as we would now refer to it, trafficked sometimes into the United States, into so-called legal and formal adoptions. And then for a number of reasons, those kids end up back in the American care system and become a part of my caseload. And my job is to try and find and engage with their original families, their first families is what we called them. So their biological families we did this work in 67 countries all over the planet. So just for context, specific example, young person, 16 years old. She's been in care for a decade when I meet her. And her primary interest is she really wants to just know where she's from, where her family's from, even if we never meet them. And we've got a huge team of people around this young lady because she's at this point living in a residential facility. And some of the folks say, well, no one ever told her that her biological family is not from the United States. She doesn't know that. She's 16 years old and she doesn't know that. And if we tell her, that's going to be traumatic. So we're not going to tell her. But if we're not going to tell her, that means what? It means there is no searching to be done. So we've got to have some story. You see the conflict? What I do for a living and what some of the other professional people think is the right thing for this child. We haven't even brought her natural network or family into that conversation yet, and we're deeply misaligned. So here's what I'd like to do. I will tell you the end of that story, but not yet. I would like maybe, Megan, for us to go into, let's do 3 small groups, breakout groups, which will be like 7 or 8 people per room. And what I'd like you to do is, I'll put this in the chat for us just so folks can have a reference to it. But given that specific example, I'd like for us to try and facilitate an alignment conversation using, her name is Tiny, the young lady. That's her real name. And she's done all kinds of cool work for us, and she's grown up now. But I'll use her real name here because she won't mind. So her name is Tiny, if you need that for reference. You're going to have to fill in some blanks because I haven't told you anywhere near the whole story because I don't know the whole story. I was just a visitor in part of the story. But what I'd like us to do is, just in these small groups, just 5 minutes, what I call try it on. So I'd like you to take these alignment questions and see if, as a group, you can hold an alignment conversation given this kind of context and specific example. It will require that some of you take one position and some of you take another. So you may find yourself taking the position in something you absolutely do not believe in. Absolutely fine. Just do your best. I know that's kind of hard. I know if I have to play the other side that said, we're going to lie to this kid, I would have had trouble. But just the point is to practice. What is it about this that we miss? And why would we spend some time aligning? And how does that help us navigate the larger complexity of, I think, the question, which is, this is systemic, right? This is an example about this kid, but you could easily be having this conversation in a legislative session. In fact, we did in 2008. Are we going to write it into the federal law that every single child with a care experience has access to a family finding process? Because they have a right to their kin. Yes or no? The big alignment conversation. It worked out pretty good. We got aligned. It's in the federal law. Not once, not twice, 3 times over the next few years. So you can do alignment in lots of different ways. But I thought we'd use a family example as a place to start because it will be most familiar to most of us. So groups of 6, 7, 8, just they can be random, Megan. Let's take 5 minutes. Work through everybody a one-liner. What do you believe the needs and concerns are? What do you believe the purpose and goals are in this specific situation, tiny situation? And then do the scaling around your hope, around your authentic commitment that something changes, around what's required for it to change. And the most important part, for the thing you will disagree on, we should tell her we shouldn't. What would it take, Megan, you and I will just demo this really fast. I'll be the hard one. You be the easy one. Megan, 0 to 10. 0 is absolutely not. We're never going to tell her. We're going to create something around this kid so that she can just live her life as best she can. 10, she absolutely deserves, has a right to, must have access to at least the process to discover. Where are you? 0 to 10.
I would say like a 9 or 10 for
Okay.
sure. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to be her lawyer,
Okay.
who said, I'm a 0. So Megan, you and I are a little misaligned.
Absolutely.
If we skip this step, what happens to her?
Oh, yeah, she's the victim and all. I mean, yeah, she
Yeah.
then has people
Yeah.
fighting the wrong battle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And she may have someone like in my role going and working in the background without being able to communicate with her about it. While she's got a lawyer continuing to tell her, by the way, just because sometimes this is unclear, especially from me because I'm severely biased about this. I think the lawyer in this situation believed with her whole body that this was the safe and right thing to do for this child.
Mhm.
So I recognize sometimes what comes up when we're doing alignment work is there's misalignment or conflict even. I use this sort of hand motion for conflict because it's lots of people in conflict. That doesn't mean for a second that the people on the other side of the perceived conflict don't think it's the absolute most reasonable thing to do at the time. This is about a young person's ability to have access to information. Could easily be something else.
So can I ask a question here?
Sure.
I guess I'm curious. I mean, there's the reason why I said a 9 or a 10 is because I'm like, I don't know much about the story to know like if there was something maybe that the lawyer knew that that made her feel, that there should be no fight. So was there additional information that she had that gave her that strong opinion or?
Yes. And it's brilliant, Megan, because it's exactly what I'm hoping will kind of simulate in small group. What do I not know that you might know that would bring us closer together? The goal for this example or any other isn't how do we get the lawyer to a 9 with Megan?
Right.
Can we be nearer to each other? Even if it's in the ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
In this particular instance, what actually happened is I came down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, I'm not sure
Mm-hmm.
how to do this well. I think we should, but I'm not sure how,
Mm-hmm.
because you've now given me information I didn't have before. Here's the information that I got to your question, Megan. Her lawyer had this, and her psychiatrist was the other 0. She was in a residential treatment facility because over the decades she'd been in the American care system, she had an incredible number of adversities in care that had escalated her stress response system so high that her behaviors, and use the air quotes there, were kind of off the charts. And when I say behaviors were off the charts, I mean her violence with other young people and her own body. So self-harm, really escalated violence around trying to take her own life. And the worry was, if we shatter this thing we've kind of perpetuated as a system for the last decade, isn't she gonna get worse?
Yeah.
Anybody ever had that question about a kid? What if this makes it worse?
But then what if it makes it better, right?
But what if it makes it better that's a beautiful alignment question. And then you get to the really important part, which is the bottom of that slide we had up on the screen. What are the required resources? What if it does get worse? What if we have a family meeting and nobody shows up? That's happened to me many, many times. What if we have a family meeting and somebody hits somebody? Right? We're really good at all the catastrophizing,
Right.
sometimes appropriately.
Right.
What if it gets better for her? And that's where the beautiful baseline and metadata and science that you all have learned over the last months, including in your time in real life with Kevin a few months ago, comes into play. The brain may not remember. This young lady didn't know, but her body knew.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? Her distress was in her body. The only complexity for her, not the only, but the big one, was she's thinking, God, I must be insane because I don't feel right in my body. I don't feel right. I feel like I want to cut into my skin. I feel like I want to take lots of pills. I feel like I want to go run in the street. She says this to people. I feel like that's what I should be doing. So the system response, okay, we'll contain her. We'll put her in a locked facility, which is where she was. Her body remembers. It's the most familiar science bit that you all will be familiar with, because it's really common from the last couple of decades, is, oh, it happened when she was a baby, so she'll forget. Babies are resilient. Babies are resilient, that is true. All people can be resilient. But even if you don't have your language center developed, or it never develops for some people, even if your prefrontal cortex, executive functioning, all that fancy stuff that happens up here in your brain, they think, isn't developed yet, your body remembers it. Your stress response is adapting all the time. In fact, all of you right now are having that experience. Your body's scanning about 10 times a second. How's it going? Do I hear anything outside? Am I listening to this? What does this mean for my work? What's my boss going to think of this? Oh, I have to remember after school, I got to go pick up the kids while I think about all of this. What about my kid, right? That's scanning all the time. So to your question, Megan, the big thing that came out of our alignment conversation was that several of the folks on her team who were at a 0 said, I'm afraid this will get worse. Okay, now we're in a real alignment conversation. What would it take? We'll switch sides for a second, Megan, just so you can demo this with me. What would it take for you, her lawyer, at a 0 to be at a 2 and worry a little less that it was going to get worse? What would it take? What would that look like?
I would want to have, I would want to have some plans in place of what are the safety nets that we have to catch her or to protect her if she does get worse.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So
how's that feel? If I could present to you right now a plan for exactly how we're going to do this and who's going to be with her while it's happening and checking in with her the next hour, the next 3 hours, the next morning, the next day after that, how would that feel?
Yeah, I would feel better about. Yeah.
Does it change your number?
Yeah.
To what?
I would say like a 4. You're saying if I'm the lawyer, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beautiful. What changed? That took us about 60 seconds.
Right. I think I think you have to approach it from the place of, well, and maybe this is another alignment piece, but that the lawyer and the psychologist had the best interest in mind for her. That them being at a 0 was them wanting to protect her, not because they wanted to keep her stuck or make things worse.
Yeah.
But assuming that alignment piece is correct, of everybody has the best interest in mind, they just have a different idea of what that looks like. But yeah, I think moving from a 0 to 4 would be, feeling like, okay, if the worst case scenario does happen, we can have a plan in place and be prepared for it to help her, help support.
Yeah, absolutely. There's maybe some of you remember this from mindful positioning. I don't know if Kevin shared the history of that particular tool. He built that after spending some time with the folks at Corrymeela, which is an interfaith community in Northern Ireland. Lots of conflict history in the world. Northern Ireland is a good example of some pretty intense conflict. So if you're not as familiar, some people say it's a religious conflict. Some people say it's a political conflict. Depends on who you ask. It also depends how long that conflict has been going, depending on who you ask. If you ask one side, they would say it's been going on for 40 years. If you ask the other side, they'd say it's been going on for 400 years. Misalignment already, right? People do what they think is reasonable at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Is their language. People do what they think is reasonable at the time. That is not, in that example, representing what they think is the best interest of this 16-year-old. It might be killing somebody as a legitimate act of war because you are on the other side. How often do we see that in the world? I think it's reasonable. This person tried to hurt people in my country. I'm going to go and hurt people in theirs. Feels reasonable all of a sudden. People do what they think is reasonable at the time, right? The context matters. And so part of alignment sometimes is recontextualizing. Mindful positioning is a way to do that. Alignment is a way to do that. What's interesting, Megan, about the 0 to 4 is nothing has actually changed other than what we think we can reasonably tolerate in our role, whatever it is. My job was the same as the lawyer's job, was the same as the psychiatrist's job, was the same as the case manager's job, to keep her safe. Mm-hmm. Are we keeping her safe by telling her a lie.
Right. Right.
That's a hard thing to deal with, but I'd much rather be turning that over and over again with other people than by myself,
Right.
which is where I started. I have to make this decision, right? No. It's our decision to make. In a totally different example or context, it might be the family's decision. Kevin and I did a consult a couple months ago with a young man in New South Wales in Australia who had lived until age 14 with his adoptive parents, but he didn't know he was adopted. Nobody told him. It's very common in Australia and Canada, particular to Indigenous and Aboriginal children. This particular young man had some pretty serious stress response dysregulation, especially as he hit puberty. Some of you have worked with kids where you don't see all of it come out until there's significant sort of biological change going on. His family's response was, we can't take this anymore. They dropped him off at this agency's door and said, see you later. So I'm going to just name something here that may be happening for some of you. It's hard not to think, excuse my French, what the hell is wrong with those parents? How could they do that to him? People do what they think is reasonable at the time. What's the context? How would we align with those folks? In that particular example, the alignment conversation happened with the professional team. Are we going to tell him? What are we going to do? But then it happened with his parents, his adoptive parents. Why didn't you tell him? Not judgment, curiosity. Why does it feel reasonable not to have? To protect him, to love him, to make sure he thinks he belongs just as all of our other children do. Just because sometimes we don't get the end of these example stories, I try to give them. This particular little boy had access to 60 of his biological family members within 2 weeks of that day where he got dropped off. Took him 2 whole weeks to find his whole family. His auntie and several other more extended family members were in New South Wales to meet him within a week of that conversation. And he went and toured them all around his city and began to connect to his Aboriginal culture, his band, his mob. And the family meetings happening for that family include his adoptive parents. And it's complicated, but they're holding together in that alignment. What do we think is reasonable? Why? What can we live with? How can we live more wisely together would be the mindful positioning question. So alignment is it's at the risk of belaboring the point here, it's the thing we skip. Because we are all human and we assume you're operating from what you think is the wisest thing in the moment or the most reasonable thing in the moment. Most of us, I think, feel like that most of the time. I know I do, in my own family even. Well, of course, this is how we're going to do it. It's reasonable. It makes sense to me. Sometimes we're misaligned there. And so this is a really, I realize it's on a slide. And so the instinct is to kind of go through it, step 1, 2, 3, at least for me. It's often just a conversation. What would it take to, Megan, if we want to keep going with Tiny's story, what if we do find people? We've told her we've told her that she's not from the United States. Now we have to make good on trying to find those folks. And what if we find them? What if we don't? What's our plan for that? What are the required resources? How long are we going to spend? Are we going to do some searching before we tell her? After? During? Is she going to be a part of it? Because she's 16. Would that be different if she was 6? Probably.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say at that age, you would let her be as involved in as much of the process as she is comfortable, right?
Mhm. Yeah. So should we try a little bit of alignment here? Should we go just so the ask from me to all of you would be to just practice your own version of this little bit of conversation that Megan and I just tried, to just feel what it feels like to be curious about what someone else thinks is reasonable. Can we come closer together on our numbers? What would it look like to go from 0 to 4, Megan? She was very clear. Oh, actually, when I think about it, this is what I would require to feel okay about this. A little bit more complex if you chose a situation where potentially someone's going to get hurt, physically hurt, die. Right? Well, I want to just acknowledge we're talking about life and death things sometimes. Tiny later would have said this was life and death for her. So should we try it?
Yeah.
What folks think? Does anyone have questions or thoughts you want to share?
Would you encourage people to use this scenario unless they have a different one?
Yes, either pick your own or just use this example one since you've got a little bit of detail now, and just 5 minutes, just facilitate a conversation, see what comes out as you try to be aligning rather than deciding what to do, would be my advice. So can you get aligned? What does that look like? What questions do you ask? What language do you use? Versus we have a decision about what to do. I suspect the second will come out if you can get to the first. That would be my prediction for us. And I'll maybe jump around, Megan. I'll try and jump to all 3 groups. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So I think I can I do breakout rooms?
Yeah, and I just want to note for anybody who's having video problems because of the weather, feel free to just keep your video off if that's better. And if you have things to add to the conversation, just unmute or participate via chat.
So Megan, you may have to help me because I don't see breakout rooms on my end like I normally do.
You know what? It may have been part of how we set up the Zoom call. And I don't know if we added that in as
Oh, okay. All right, that's fine. We'll pivot.
okay.
Instead of breakout rooms, let's do it this way. Let's just do a simple version of this just so folks can get a sense of it. Everybody in the chat for me, please. 0 to 10, where are you? 0 to 10. I think the right thing, 10, is to tell this kid and then work on seeing if we can engage some of the people from her original family. 10, absolutely must do it today. 0, no, never going to happen. Where are you? And if I had to guess, we're going to have something happen here. That's always really nice when you're doing alignment, which is everybody's pretty much on the same page. Got lots of 7s, a few 6s, 1 9. So for the folks who are at a 6 or a 7, what would get you to an 8 or a 9? What's one thing we might do as her network that would get you to an 8 or a 9? Feeling like it's okay, it's the right thing. And just go ahead and pop that in that chat too. It can be simple. What would bring you up a number or 2? Megan offered one example already. So you can use that one or a different one. knowledge of resources and supports available. Yeah. Ask her how she would feel. Love that one. Shemaine, now we're going into whose life is this? I think we talked last time we were together, some of you were with us, about power threat meaning. Whose power is operating right now as we're all talking about this, even as an example. Making a decision for this young person who's not even here, nor is her family.
Yeah, I think going along with Shameen's thing, the other thought I had was if she knew all the different possibilities of this scenarios, like was she aware of like what the outcomes might be of a search, and
Yeah.
what were her feelings about it?
Yeah.
Like mentally and emotionally preparing her for the different outcomes.
Yeah. It's interesting, Megan, when you think about it that way, at least for me, I think not just about this particular example or decision for her. But notice the preposition. We're making a decision for her rather than with her, or better yet, done by her. She's 16. And if we are going to operate in her life that way, are we doing that forever? She's 16 now. In 10 years, are you still going to be willing to make all these decisions for her or deal with the consequences of the fact that no one ever told her that she's not from the United States, that she's got an entire biological family out there somewhere? It's interesting to think of, right? That's the sort of trajectory. I'm weaving in some of the tools we've learned together the last couple of months. That would be the trajectory. So what test, Kevin used to call it. So what if we don't tell her? So what if we do? So what if we tell her and then we can't locate anybody? She doesn't have access to her story. Morello, the other example that you all know so well, that was a possibility. We knew she was from Romania. That was it. That may have been the information she had.
Can I add to that? Let's
Please.
it's worth, sometimes we'll forget this, but and all those questions, and I'm just catching up with you guys slowly here, but there's something else to remember around those questions. Millions of human beings have lived with those questions.
That's right.
Sometimes someone in the group has lived with those questions, has been adopted, for example. Um, Rather than thinking about how there's I'll say it a different way. In Judaism, there's a particular thing that rabbis have been teaching for about 3,500 years to people. And that is that when you face a challenging circumstance in your life, rather than trying to invent a unique solution, what you should do instead is look to the wise people who came before you. There are millions of people right now on this planet who are living with questions about who they are and where they come from because they were denied that truth in something we call adoption and other practices, unfortunately, including modern day slavery for children. Um, People who have been created through a process of surrogacy or through um, through an insemination process with a anonymized donor. Millions of people at different places in their experiences with these very same questions who live with this reality every day. And we can look to them for answers. I'll give you an example, by the way, of a wonderful web resource called Harlow's Monkey. Um, Harlow's Monkey is a blog that's been on for a few decades by a friend of ours, and she was adopted from Korea and as a little girl and has been denied the truth about her family life. And she was adopted by a white family. And so she has this experience of not knowing who she is. And she's an academic here at the University of Washington who also is a prolific researcher around adoption. So I'll just don't want to lose the main point. The main point I'm making is as you confront as you have the privilege, and I'll call it that, the privilege of engaging with the person who has a unique to you experience of the way their life has unfolded. One thing that you can do that is wise is instead of inventing a wholly new solution for that, you and that person might look to people around them and people who have come before them, who have been through this experience, and people can find that they are not alone, that they are part of a community of people who have had a similar experience and have a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge to draw upon as they face how to live with their circumstances. Um, so we talk about being a catalyst, a convener, and a facilitator. Not, let me tell you what we're not. We're not the doers of all things. We're not the oracle that gives a solution to every person who has a life situation that is overwhelming, because we don't have to be. We can look to wise people around them and around ourselves and people who come before us. And in most human situations, people have faced these problems before. Yeah. Anyway, thank you.
I promised I'd tell you what happened with this particular young lady, so I will tell you. So we did a lot of alignment work with her team, and we came to the agreement exactly as Megan and I just did, that we were going to tell her, and that we were going to then ask her what she thinks and what she wants to do. And we had a plan in place for how to support her in the minutes, hours, and days following, kind of having a particular narrative about her life shattered, which is that, she was in foster care in the United States and her family didn't want her, was the story she had. I think it took her about 10 minutes to decide what she wanted to do once we told her. Maybe 15 minutes, I'm not sure, but it was pretty fast. She said, I want to do the looking. And then something else really interesting, and it won't be surprising to any of you, happened. She said, I think part of me knew this. And the reason I think part of me knew this is because it explains some of the things. She's a very wise young lady. We have a poem from her that we've read before. This is tiny, Kevin. I think part of me knew this. The searching took a little bit longer, but it turned out that although her parents both were from Sierra Leone, they had both made their way to the United States since she had been in American care. And her dad lived right down the street from her for the last several years of her life. The end of that particular part of the story is really painful and really difficult, which is we found him. I talked to him. He was over the moon about the fact that his daughter was just a couple of blocks from him. And then he died within days of that conversation before she got to meet him. And she says that was really painful. But she says it was also a gift because she got to go to his funeral and meet her entire paternal family. People flew all the way around the world to go to his funeral. And she got to meet them all and know them all and have relationships with many of them. And I tell that part of the story because it's nice to know what happened, right? We don't always get that. But also because I always hesitate to present things as these magical. We have a dear friend in Belgium who calls them Alleluia stories, the ones you see on Lifetime or other, sort of family networks. She finds them. It's beautiful. They have all these wonderful Hollywood experiences. It doesn't always go like that. In fact, most of the time it doesn't go like that. It's complicated. It continues to be, but it's her complication. It's her life. It's her joy and suffering. It's her family. It's her decisions to make.
I'll just react with you to suggest it's always complicated. each of your stories is complicated. From an outsider's perspective, your stories are complicated. And that's what makes you unique and particularly important. And I think we don't want to deny people the reality of the complications of their stories, of their lives. Also, if I could just say, because I've had some of those too, it's another reminder in situations like this, time isn't always your friend. While we take time to work out what it means to us, if you had taken longer, if the referral had come a few months later, she wouldn't have had ever met him. She wouldn't have been at the funeral. She wouldn't have. It would have all have happened before she had an opportunity to have any personal connection to it. And by the way, part of grieving is grieving with your family, the loss of someone you love. In fact, it's the only way we grieve. We grieve together, not alone. And time's not our friend.
Yeah. Mhm. I think this fits to the one of the questions you read at the beginning. I've been so shocked by the historical context of our system, also inspired by all these frameworks and stories, but I'm overwhelmed about where to start. So are there any simple steps or guidelines? I thought we might answer that question together by doing a bridge, because it's probably all of ours to answer. And I'm aware that it's maybe time to take a quick break before we jump into more. Folks may need to stretch, stand up, move around, get some water or coffee or tea. What do we think? I see folks nodding. Would a break be good? A little quick break? Okay. Should we come back at 10:35? Is that too much time? That's about 10 minutes.
No, that's
now.
great. That sounds
Yeah.
great. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. We'll take a 10-minute break. If you've got other questions coming up, feel free to pop them in the chat. Welcome back, everybody. Most of us are coming back in here. And Megan, please obviously let us know if anybody submitted questions. I got one here in the chat privately, so I'll make sure we
great.
get to that.
I did just check and there aren't any new ones yet. So.
No problem. So as we were settling back in here, I shared with Kevin and Megan that one of the things that this young lady we've been talking about, her name's Tiny, as I said, and she that's a nickname, obviously, but she was very, very small, and at least in stature, and incredibly powerful in personality, even when I first met her. And so one of the many things that she did with me and taught me was how to sometimes communicate effectively. And one of the ways she did that at some point was she wrote a poem that she's given me permission to read whenever, but she also read it to her judge in one of her permanency review hearings. That's the first time we heard this. It's very short, but I just thought I'd read it to you because I think it gets at some of the untangling we were doing about power in this particular example. So here's what she wrote. What do you need? What do you need? Every day, every week, every month, for years and years, people have asked me, what do you need? I don't know. I'm just a little girl. But my mother knows what I need. My grandmother knows what I need. My sister knows what I need. Why don't you ask them? Wait, I changed my mind. I know what I need. I need my mother, my grandmother, my sister, and they need me too, to be their daughter, granddaughter, sister. Now I know what I need, and we can do it together. If someone will just ask me, please, one more time, what do you need? 16. And could probably run the world instead of all of us. Wouldn't that be great? She would be, let's see, how old is she now? She's 31 this year. So this was a while ago. She'd be 31 this year. Anyway, just thought I'd share that little bit from her. Very powerful young person. So
Yeah.
I want to.
I just want to use it to get to this. the going back to needs and services design systems, the I think that story illustrates again the the risk we face in the work we do for particular agencies and particular funding streams is that we confuse what it is that we have to sell with what people need. We can only deliver the programs that we have. We can only deliver within the funding streams that we utilize. And we're taught very quickly to see how to fit individual experiences into those things. And we call those things assessments. Um, and so Tiny's never heard because everybody's desperate to help her, but their view of helping is always from the standpoint of the organization they work for, rarely from her perspective.
I also think it's interesting, Kevin, that even before Tiny knows the context of her family, what is she saying she needs? Her people, her community, her parents, her sibling, right? So just for timeline wise, for folks who aren't as familiar, she's writing this before we've done most of her work together, her family finding work. It's not something you can, right? I said earlier, even though the narrative she's got is nobody wanted her, she got kind of dumped in care, her body knows, right? The body remembers. Her body remembers. And so as she writes this, people are asking her what she needs, and even without any context, she can answer. And it's not something we can sell or commodify or, yeah.
Well, it isn't. But having been a former foster parent, and I can sell the empty bed in my house.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's again, we're going to get to this. We've got a system with problems. We've all worked hard, many of us for our whole careers, to make that system better. I would argue we have made some progress, but there is much to be done. So what do we do when you feel called to the work you do, and yet you do it in an imperfect system? And that's really what we're trying to explore here. As I said at the when I visited you, they're not coming. And what I meant was nobody's coming to fix this for you. Um, and I mean that in this context at an individual level. Why do I do the work I do? Why this thing, not other things? You could do there's so many things you might do, each of you, but you do this thing. I argue that there would be a reason why you do this thing, and it has to do with who you are, what you feel called to be. And we work in an imperfect structure that has a long history of oppression. How do you negotiate that? And in the simplest way, we're about to do that to get started. It's to recognize in practice. I was thinking when I stepped away for a minute about this to make this point. I did a year-long project in the state of Montana years ago. The director of the Child Welfare Agency in Montana had worked for the agency for 30 years. She was trained as a lawyer. Her great claim to her success was she personally had written the state's policy manual for state child welfare. She had written the whole thing, all of it. And I had spent a year visiting there and coaching caseworkers and CASA volunteers around a group of an extremely endangered young people. And the practice they did was world class. It was just extraordinary. A funny example, a few years ago, I was invited to be a witness in a hearing on Capitol Hill in the Senate Finance Committee, and I was there with some of you might know this guy. I was there with Antoine Fisher. And if you know there's a film called Antoine Fisher. So Antoine and I are the witnesses in this Senate Finance hearing, and The chairman of the committee at the time was Max Baucus, who was the senator from Montana, coincidentally. And this was like 6 or 7 years after I had done this project. And Baucus, I don't know if you've ever been in these hearings before, but the ranking member and then the chairperson of the committee read prepared statements, and then they bring in the testimony and questions for members. And Baucus is the chairman, so he goes first. And what does he do? But he reads a story about one of the kids whose practice I had coached 7 years before in Montana, a boy who had become so desperate with the conditions of his life that he was living in a locked psychiatric facility in Wyoming, not even in his home state, with another boy from Montana, and in a locked, secure facility. And it was on a day when there was a blizzard, and it was minus 20 below outside. And the two boys had made a plan. They had figured out how they could escape the building, and they waited for their opportunity to do it. And they took their shoes and their socks off, and they wore only a t-shirt and pants. And they had planned this. And they made their break when they had seen the opportunity, when it was 20 below and it was a whiteout blizzard outside, and they did it to end their lives. And they both bolted out of the building and disappeared into the whiteout, and they couldn't be located. It was too dangerous. The next morning, they were found and they were somehow alive, although he was severely frostbitten in his lower extremities and ended up in the hospital, and it was unclear if he would keep his legs or not. And that was the story that was brought to me in the coaching session, and we spent the next year working together. We found his grandparents that day a mile from the Capitol building where we were doing the work in this capital city. Um, when the workers first went to the grandparents' house and knocked on the door, and they opened the door, they identified themselves, and the grandparents swore at them, told them to never bother them again, slammed the door in their faces. They were so angry about how they had lost their grandson 10 years before and never been given the opportunity to be in his life. And the workers came back to me, and they were, yeah, hey, smart guy, this is what happened. You know, what do you want us to do? And I said, I want you to go back, and I want you to knock on the door. And when I open the door, I want you to tell them you're sorry. I want you to apologize. It's not about what they do. It's about what you do. You need to be the face on this government today, on your democracy, and you need to take responsibility for what they are trying to tell you your government has done to them. And so they went back and they knocked on the door, and the folks answered the door very hostily, ready to really run them off. And they very urgently said, we came back just to say simply, we're sorry. We're deeply sorry for what has happened to you and your family and for our part in it. And we hope that you would give us a chance to make it right somehow. It's a year later, and the boy, I'm leaving. It's our last day of the project. And that's the story Bacchus is telling. He's telling the story of what happens to this boy. A year later, on the last day I was there, the boy's airplane touched down, and his grandparents met him at the plane, and he went home with his legs, fortunately. And Bacchus is reading this story, and he's reading it not about me. He doesn't know that I was there. He's reading it to celebrate the practice of state workers in Montana through the story of this incredible story of recovery and this incredible story of humility, of service on the part of government employees. And he's reading that to Antoine Fisher and I as his opening statement in the hearing. But it gets away from the point. It was the last day. I'm there, and the director of the agency never came to a single session, was always hostile to our project, but somehow let it happen because the legislature wanted it to happen. And I get in the elevator to go up to the third floor of the building, and who gets in the elevator with me but the director of the agency? I don't say a word to her. She didn't say a word to me. We get upstairs to the big meeting room. We go in. All the people in the project are there. The legislators are there. We're going to debrief a year of work and what happened to every child, including that one. And the last thing that I said to her is why I told you the story to make the point as we do this exercise. And that was, remember, I knew that the thing she was proud of was having written the state's manual, that she was a lawyer, that she was proud of her lawyering skills as director of the agency. And what I said to her that I had learned over that year was that she had written the policy manual and she had written it really well in the way that lawyers write policy manuals. And that is that she wrote a policy manual that was wide enough that it could hold the worst and most inhumane practice that people might do at the agency and stay out of trouble, or big enough to allow people to do world-class work without breaking a single rule. As a policy manual, it was perfect if your goal was to protect the agency. There's enough room in every policy manual that you are associated with to do either some of the worst practice you might do to people, but there is also enough room in there to do humane, highly effective, and impactful practice in the systems we already have. You're the bridge, each of you, between what your system does and what it doesn't do, with the work you do with the young people you work with the other adults that you work with. You're the bridge in your practice, and that's our Elizabeth and I, our message, that we don't know if the reforms we're all hoping for are ever going to come in the time when we might want them or need them. But there's enough room in your policy manuals for you to be the reform, for you to work at your practice. But you have to actually work at it. You have to deeply think about it. And it's in one way we begin to do that with people is through this exercise called bridges. Liz, I'm not sure if you're still able, but I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
Oh, by the way, Bacchus does a statement, and I'm supposed to go next, but what does Bacchus do? Instead of handing it to me as the first witness, he resigns from the Senate right in front of us. And it becomes the top news story in the nation. And he walks out to the reporters to give a press conference, completely deflates the entire hearing after reading this incredible thing. And that's Bacchus leaving the Senate that day. Anyway, thanks.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna just show an example and then maybe we can each try this. This is something you can do on a piece of paper or on your computer, but it's a nice way, I think, to be reflective about your practice and maybe answer the question that I keep coming back to, which is there's a lot here. Where do I start? How do I hold momentum and inspiration and all the things this person asked? Bridges is a great way to do that. I want to give credit to something here, which is we often in this context use bridges as a way to be reflective and define future action. You can absolutely use this with families, whole families, individual people, young people. It's a sort of an alignment tool in its own way because it helps you get clear on directionality, where we're going, where we've been, why, all those things, and just kind of untangling it into a really simple format. And it's drawing, so for the folks who think better in images, this will work well for you. If that's not you, absolutely fine. The art is not the point, just the exercise is the point. So let me just show a couple examples of this, maybe. There we go. So this is a good one because it's got the questions right on it. But the metaphorical way to think about this is when we say bridges, we are thinking about journey, crossing over, all the things that bridges represent for different folks here. And we often, as I'm going to guide us through in a minute, ask particular questions as a way to go along your bridge, your journey of a bridge. So this is just one example. I think I can't even remember who made this. I want to say it was somebody in the UK made this while we were talking it through during a workshop at some point. But she didn't write her answers, she wrote the questions that we often ask. So it's an interesting sort of guidance system, and I'm going to use it for us here. So grab something, a piece of paper and a pen or a marker or pencil, whatever you've got access to. Or if you are more technologically inclined, also find, open up a blank Paint document or PowerPoint document on your computer. And then I'm just going to guide us through this. This will be for you individually. So it's just your thoughts, your responses, your feelings. And when you're ready, if you're using a piece of paper, I suggest that you bring to mind a bridge of your choosing. Could be just a fictive one that you're drawing. It could be a familiar one that you love. It could be one that you've crossed over many times in your life. But just put a likeness of that bridge onto your page. If you're using your device, you can Google said bridge or a bridge and pop it on your screen. And I want you to think about what it represents for you, what the bridge represents. What's it made of? What's it look like? If it's a real place, what do you remember about being there? And then we're gonna do 4 parts that I hope kind of connect the dots here. The first one is, if it's a real place that you've been to, you can probably recall the moment before you crossed it. I think one of the times recently that I was in California, I saw your very famous Golden Gate Bridge. There's a feeling associated with crossing that particular bridge. It's a big one. It sways a little bit in the wind, for example. So just think about yourself either in your car or standing at the foot of this. The one I've got up on the screen is a footbridge. You're standing there, or you're sitting in your car, or you're on your bicycle, or whatever mode of transportation you've got. And it's likely at this point in your incredible time doing this work, commitment to the people you're working with, that you're carrying a lot of things in your arms, in a backpack, in the trunk of your car. They may be particular models or methodologies, ideas, statistics, data, belief systems, values, biases. What are you carrying? And maybe just write down a couple of big ones. What are you carrying in your backpack of practice? There's no right answer for this. So I find when we go through this, often the first time I'm looking for what is the thing I'm supposed to say. It's whatever it is for you. What are you carrying in your practice? And when you're ready, of the things you're carrying, are there things you're carrying that don't serve you, that you'd like to set down on the ground and cross the bridge without them? What are those things? Again, they may be particular beliefs, values, practices, processes. I'll give you 2 examples from, I've talked a little bit about Philadelphia, so that's where my early work started, my practice work. One of the things that I wrote down the first time I did this is that I believed, Megan, I'm thinking about you here, we do what we think is reasonable at the time. Remember that language. I believed that my job in running a family finding program in Philadelphia was to find people who were better than the parents that left their kids in the system. I thought like that. I believed that. And that really didn't serve me. in the work I was trying to do. And I use that example for a couple reasons. One, it's a little bit painful. And sometimes what we discover in kind of answering these big questions and thinking about all these processes and practices, and I'm thinking also about the conversation yesterday, Megan, is the thing that might come up for you is grief or shame or whatever it may be. And we say, great, because grief is actually growth. When you can let go of things that no longer serve you, when you can see things differently. I am certain, by the way, that will be true for all of us 10 years from now, just as it was for me 10 years ago. There is something right now that I believe or think or use all the time that in 10 years I might say, oh, nope, that wasn't it. That's growth. But sometimes feels like grief too, and that's okay. So what are the things you're carrying that you might want to set down, let go of, release? Keep in mind, this comes up a lot for folks. Some of the things you're carrying, you might not have picked them up. Somebody might have handed them to you.
Yeah. It might have been in the backpack you were handed,
Yeah.
the metaphoric backpack you're given, policy manual, the traditions of service in the organization or system you're a part of. They're just handed to you. I think we're given other things also. And Liz, when I looked at this picture, I think it's a beautiful image this person created and also meaningful. And clearly you can see that we're using metaphor here, that sometimes it's hard to use metaphor in learning, but it can be really useful. But it made me think of the broader context of things that were handed. And if I wondered if I could read a quote that this brought to me from Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates wrote, his favorite book of mine is called Between the World and Me, and it's a book that he wrote for his son. And he has an interesting perspective, and I wanted to read it. This fits this picture. He said, "The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemptive history. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine. Enslavement was not destined to end, and it is wrong to claim our present circumstances, no matter how improved, as the redemption for the lives of people who never asked to be posthumously untouchable, for the posthumous untouchable glory of dying for their children. Our triumphs can never compensate for this. Perhaps our triumphs are not even the point. Perhaps struggle is all we have, because the God of history is an atheist, and nothing about his world is meant to be. So you must wake up every morning knowing that no promise is unbreakable, least of all the promise of waking up at all. This is not despair. There are the preferences of the universe itself, verbs over nouns, actions over states, struggle over hope." I think particularly I've shared that with you. He's saying that each of the people who die in the struggle to end slavery are not bricks in the road, that, like Obama says, that the moral universe does not bend towards justice. It doesn't excuse the harms that we do to people, the losses that they've experienced. And for me, that's maybe my radical take when I look at this. What am I committing to? I'm committing to a personal viewpoint of what I stand for and what I do and what I don't do, how I make sense of it. Every every tragic experience in the life of people that I've worked for is not made okay because one day a reform will come that will make it all right. The struggle is in every situation, not in doing things mindlessly, hoping one day somebody will come and rescue us. These people are not bricks in the road, and neither are you. So anyway, I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I was thinking about looking at this picture.
Yeah. The
Yeah.
bricks, especially. Yeah.
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 The bricks in the bridge. They're not people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you haven't already, part of what's I think valuable about this is that when we think about what we might set down, let go of, release, say goodbye to it that no longer really serves you, I encourage folks to actually write it or draw it at your feet. Leave it at your feet before we cross this bridge into what's next. How am I going to maintain the inspiration, practice, in all the new ways I want to. And I'll add one that I think of a lot when I think of this group and the first time I met some of you. Continue doing the beautiful practice you've been doing. I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes when we think about what we may do differently, that we have to stop doing everything we've been doing. And that's almost never true. I think when we get to go and hang with folks in the world, I often see moments and sometimes long moments of incredible practice. So that's valuable too. And it kind of leads to this next bit. What's foundational? What serves my work well that I want to continue to value? What are your bricks? They're not people, but what are they? Or your steel cables or your pillars or whatever makes up your bridge. What are those things? What are those values, beliefs, inspirations? What keeps you going? Why learn more? Why change or stay the same? Why examine anything? What is it for you? It's different for all of us.
Just again, using the bricks as one word we might use to describe those bricks are values.
Yeah.
When we talk about another tool we use, which is called interviewing for intentional strengths, where we confront the idea that behavior is not actionable. Behavior doesn't teach us anything. We want to get underneath behavior. Under what we want to get to are the things that people hold on fiercely to, the things that they believe in, the things that we believe in, that animate how we carry ourselves. And just a little bit, maybe not as personal, but to give you an example of how powerful beliefs can be, Liz and I and Cormac Russell have a new article that are coming out early this year in the Journal of Family. Is it the Family Justice Journal, Liz? Yeah, Liz is on I think you're on the board there, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So at the Family Justice Journal. So in the last article, I'll just read this. This is interesting. Just think about the power of values and how it shapes the world in this particular way. In fact, it's so powerful. There's a document for this. We wrote this. We conclude by sharing a glimpse into the World Values Survey to understand comparatively how different governance and national value systems may impact positively or negatively individual, citizen, and community well-being. Here are the top three operating values for three Scandinavian countries: Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Number one, mitigate income inequality first. So the first value of these three governments in their as a nation is to mitigate income inequality between their citizens. That's their first value. Their second value, promote free and universal access to a high quality education. And their third value, promote the health and well-being of all citizens. That's their values. Here are the top three operating values of the United States government: protect people from international threats, keep people safe from criminals in your neighborhood, promote economic growth. Can you see the difference in where power is placed and where value is placed in the way we operationalize our values comparatively? There's this document that you can look at, looks at all of the major world wealthy countries and how their top three values are organized, and then you can look at what happens in their societies. But I think it's relevant to us, our coming to clarity about values, about what do you stand for. What do you stand for enough that you're willing to clear out space in your backpack and make sure you've got room for those things and take them with you over the bridge.
Third piece, if you can imagine yourself doing those things, where does it take you? What's the world look like? What's the work look like? And again, you can jot down some simple images for that, or you can use words. Where does the bridge lead me? If I can set down things that no longer serve and hang on to that which does, was her question. Where does it take you? And I might encourage us, given the context of today's kind of thinking and conversation, to think about where it takes you in terms of your practice in general, your decision making, where you stand in the system, how you think about or respond to the language Kevin and I have been using. No one's coming. So what are you going to do with families or facilitate done by families? How about with colleagues? How about in an alignment context? Can you imagine using this bridge in a group of folks trying to align around decision making or practice? For a young person, for a policy change, lots of different ways to use this. Where does it take you? What's it look like on the other side of your bridge? And if you're willing, one last piece to consider that we talk about a lot. How is power represented in your bridge, on your journey? Who holds it? Who doesn't? Which way does it flow? Any or all of those questions welcome. How's power operating? Does something change about power when you look at where you're standing at the beginning of your bridge and what it looks like on the other side? I do this most often with our language from our beloved friend Cormac. At the beginning of my bridge, I'm making decisions for families or doing my practice to families. On the other side of the bridge, with families, or better yet, things done by families. I think Kevin said earlier, saying goodbye at hello, because things are done by families, by communities, and you get to be the catalyst, convener, facilitator of that. What a place to stand. Just as for those of you who maybe have a harder time with the metaphorical nature of this, I'll give you an example of how somebody represented power once. She had it was like a Golden Gate-like bridge. So a big one, lights on the top so that the airplanes wouldn't run into it. That's how high it was. And she said, I'm on this side getting ready to cross. Families are always on the other side, right? So I'm trying to get to my families. Notice the language, get to my families. That's a power operating there. And she said, and my bridge has all these lights on it. And I know that there's something wrong with how the power is currently situated, because this side where I sit with all of the professional folks or the government folks decides when we turn the lights off and on. Literally decides when people sit in the light or the dark. Really interesting metaphor for power and how she was feeling about how our these big things we call systems, but just big groups of people, are operating. We decide when the lights are on or off.
Again, I still have the draft article open, and I thought I'd mention, maybe I'll just read, if I could read just something to you from it. And what we've done here is we've been thinking about, particularly since the murder of George Floyd and then the pandemic, sort of in the child welfare context, one of the things that we've been seeing persistently has been described as a workforce crisis. And I think we've seen some evidence of that in your county as well, right? Where I've heard, at least at the county agency, a lot of unfilled positions. I think that's still the case. Is that fair, Megan? I don't know if I'm putting you on the spot, right? So I wanted to read to you. We were trying to make some sense of this and organize different responses to oppressive systems in a particular context. And we've described 5 of them in this context. So the first one is ignoring the message. The message: consumers of our services mostly appreciate our care, and their complaints are handled efficiently. Primarily, this is a response of bureaucracies, mainly governmental, large charities, academic institutions, and health insurance companies. In these large systems, tasks are shared by various groups of people from multiple siloed departments, which exist in hierarchical and retaliatory structures. Employees and executives say, when criticized, I have never personally harmed anyone, and I'm doing my job to the best as possible. By design, of course, the harm done is distributed. The collective impact of those receiving services is the harm is hidden and treated as if it did not happen. And if it did, it was not me or my team. Professor Lawrence Lessig at Harvard shared his work on institutional corruption, observes one never sees corruption within one's life, but it's easy to see in the lives of others. For example, child protection agencies rarely see their institutional corruption, but they find it easy to see corruption in the lives of nearly every parent. Our mental health industries do not see the corruption of their practice inherent in the selling of diagnoses of theoretical disease or disorder as a means to situate the problem in the person, ignoring a consensus view in science that the community conditions are more predictive than genes. However, they can readily see and name the corruption in every patient's minds, thoughts, feelings, and relationships. Attacking Don't listen to these people. They avoid responsibility for their actions. We know this because our research and other researchers in the academy prove that what they say is not valid. Pres This has been the response of some well-known present-day and retired academics, supported by present and former leaders of bureaucracy, often trained by the same scholars. This type of corruption of institutional mission is known as capture. The academic becomes dependent on the institution it studies for income and status, and the institution is dependent on the academic for continued legitimacy. Co-opting parents, or more often youth advisory boards to institutions or programs, showing others that the firm is an ally of lived experience experts, adopting or briefly offering funding to popular, sometimes potentially disruptive innovations or people, gradually exerting increasing levels of controlling influence and coercively threatening to withdraw or reduce economic support for the program or the person. This approach is most used by industry-aligned and affiliated philanthropic groups. This tactic has been described as jumping in front of parades to steal attention for itself and control the direction or possibility of an innovation or change. It's also a consequence of capture, resulting from dependence on access for relevance, status, or influence. Befriending the revolution, a high-risk commitment for individuals seeking to continue to be invited by industry or programs and be paid or funded by the industry or an industry-aligned benefactor. High returns interpersonally if you're willing to reorder daily life and career or personal goals. It can result in a strong sense of purpose and meaning and may require people to invent or join others to become helpful bystanders rather than returning to past roles. For most, however, relying on the industry you are reforming for economic resources or access may result in a new experience of capture, requiring one to leave it altogether or rejoin the industry's orbit. And finally, refusing to be part of systems and models of oppression. The so-called workforce crisis is part of the revolution. Many refuse to continue to be associated with systems of oppression. The calculation becomes clear. There are healthier, more just ways to serve or at least live than continuing to be complicit with these systems. For some, joining or inventing advocacy groups funded elsewhere provides authentic activism or invention opportunities for ethically aligning life, purpose, and opportunity. So just a comment there on different observations of responses that we've seen in different helping industries, particularly since George Floyd's murder and following the pandemic, as we look at how people are reordering their work lives and their personal lives, or not doing that. We're doing something different with you here, which fits our personal practice, which is taking responsibility for our own practice within whatever system we work in. There's Where our experience has been, there's a lot of room to do really good work, even in the systems we have. And the experience that we can have in our roles can be very fulfilling and not um, compromise us if we'll invest um, the work it takes to unlock what we've called an untapped human capability. And that untapped human capability we're talking about is in the very people you work with, in the people that care about them and they care about, in their neighborhoods, and in the communities they live in. There's an extraordinary untapped capability, and our methodologies that come out of PLA work, which is participatory learning in action, suggest that the way to tap into that is by limiting the role you take into one of three things: functioning, as we've said before, as a convener, a catalyst, or a facilitator, not the doer of all things. Don't use your power, let them use theirs, and don't get in the way of that. So, anyway, I don't know if that was helpful, but I just thought I would read it to you.
I think it's interesting, Kevin. The thing that always comes to mind when we think about this for me is the over-functioning language or the managerialism, which is part of the sometimes function when we're thinking about big complex problems, as all of you are, is to over-function in it rather than exist together in the challenge. Right. We have a couple examples, but one that comes to mind for me, the family took me way longer than I'd like to admit to understand this from this family, but they kept saying the point is to come together. The point is to be together. We're not going to solve this. There is no solution. What they were dealing with in their family was many generations old. I know in your community you think a lot about intergenerational pain, trauma. This family said, there's no fix. This happened. It's about being together and learning to live with that, not changing what happened. And I think sometimes in sort of the systems thinking and even practice thinking within those systems, we are positioned to think we are the fix, or we're going to define the fix, rather than think about how to live wisely together, or how people facilitate, to use these three words, catalyze, convene, or facilitate how people might live wisely. Tiny's family knows how to say goodbye when somebody dies. And she just got welcomed right into that fold, didn't she? We found your dad. A week later, he's passed away. A week after that, she's at his funeral. His family knows how to do that. Being together in the challenge, rather than the sort of over functioning, or I use this other word, managerialism, which comes from, what's her name, Kevin, the woman in the UK? Sorry,
Eileen Monroe.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
There's some real, I'll try and find it and put it in the chat for folks who are interested, but particularly those of you who are grappling with the, how do I kind of look at myself as a one person in this big thing? I find that's where I get overwhelmed most of the time. I'm just one person. How could I possibly? Eileen has some interesting thinking about that.
Yeah.
That might be valuable to folks. Yeah.
I don't know if this is helpful, but I just thought, if you don't mind, I'm just going to read the beginning part of our article to make sense of the end. Then I'm just going to read a bit of it, and because it sets a context that's relatable to what we've talked about. Let's see. We're not trying to limit this. I'll just start here. People affected by social services and health programs face tremendous difficulties. They tell researchers they value services that support them, their families, and communities to live socially, environmentally, and economically secure lives. Community members also say that to be part of a just and dignity-filled experiences, they must be the essential architects and authors of their own lives, determining how they will respond to their hardships and what support they would welcome or not welcome in support of their plans. Citizens and communities involved with publicly funded services say they do not exist to be in service to, or worse, to become transformed from persons to objects that guarantee power and revenue to programs or profit for private industry. A consensus view is crystallized, demanding that the power relationships between governments, agencies, professionals, youth, parents, and other community members change. Government-sponsored and imposed services must move from supplanting or supplementing um, must move from supplanting to supplementing, replacing the toxic malalignment that places institutions in monopolistic and syndicalistic roles that subjugate citizens and their associations. People are speaking out about the harms they experience from these systems, demanding a revolution of a specific type. They're demanding much more than the promise of incremental reforms from oppressive systems, but a full complement of human freedoms, nothing less. These freedoms include justly having access to and benefits from the same public goods, services, and protections offered to wealthy, white, privileged, and powerful men, the most politically and socially advantaged humans ever to exist on Earth. Um, we're writing for, and I need to apologize, we're writing for um, an academic journal, and in that sort of writing, we're very provocative and very pushy, but we're articulating there the direction that we hear from tribes, that we hear from individuals and communities around the world, that they would value governance that supports them in their efforts um, to make use of their capabilities and freedoms rather than to be on the receiving end of a strategy where government organizations feel like they're responsible for creating solutions to people's problems. We're just reversing the direction in a plain way. So anyway, thanks.
I wanted to just invite if some folks either in the chat or you can come off mute as well. I would love to hear what folks are thinking as you've done your bridge. Are there particular things you're willing to share about what you set down or what you see at the other end of the bridge, or what's foundational to you? What'd you notice doing this? What'd you come up with? You can write in the chat too. I know I'm mindful of people's internet woes with your wonderful weather there. So if the chat's easier for you, that's fine. I'm trying not to pick on the few folks that are on camera because I know you all are happen to have the internet working. These are just 3 examples from the chat, but folks did write in the chat. So in case you can't see it, I'm gonna read them aloud. The first one, reflecting on bridges here. I serve, my role is to serve. I need to see what serves me in my work, but never forget my role in their lives. There's an incredible clarity in that for me. Thank you, Shimeen. Bonnie, path from a backpack of tools to a community of health and well-being. Beautiful. That's beautiful, Bonnie. From Jade, I noticed the value in continuing to take personal accountability, to let go of judgment of the system and work forward, having a clear goal and continuing to serve the work. Yeah, serve the work, not the system.
You know, we named our company, as you can see, it's in your face, Pale Blue Dot, and I think we mentioned to you this was an homage to the Voyager 1 picture showing us at 13 million miles away. And just this, literally the literal truth that we cannot get our heads around, that we are the only life in the known universe.
Mm-hmm.
And what has been said about humans is we're the only thinking life in the known universe. And the idea is not to leave people feeling insignificant, but quite the opposite. What a miracle. What a miracle. And I feel like we have the honor, each of us in the work we are doing, we we choose to be, with I guess the message is that we choose to stand with people because they're miracles. That your son's mother gave you a miracle, and it was enough. And you're sorry for her pain, but it is incredible, and we ask, like, am I standing in the place where I can do the most good? Am I standing in the place where I can? It's just this constant questioning about what we would call position and question, position and question, position and question. Maria, you have your hand up. Oh,
Oh,
you're muted.
yeah, I just wanted to share kind of my experience with doing this. So I work at the Family Resource Center under First Five. So I'm kind of sometimes in the middle. I facilitate parenting groups. So sometimes I get, folks who have lost their children or, caregivers who have taken on children, family members, and things like that. And just sometimes I get stuck in something that I do want to like recognize and kind of leave behind is that feeling of, okay, well, they're giving you this list of things that you need to do. If taking my class is one of them, why don't you just do it so you can, get your children or get the children that you need. And, just recognizing how that is feeding into that, okay, well, the parent is the problem, and
Mhm.
saying like, okay, there's these things, so just do it. But, also once you get to know the different situations or, getting to know the families and they open up to you, finding out that it's much more complex than just attend these classes or make these meetings or, show up to court and things like that. And, I think that comes from that like decolonizing mindset of, just listen to the authority and do what they say so you can, be a part of this child's life. And, I think it like tied it back to me to like, where do I want this bridge to lead me to? And that's, like having parents and caregivers feel like they can lean on, their community. They can lean on the supports already in place that maybe they're not aware of, or maybe, they felt like, oh, I don't need a parenting class, or I don't need to learn more about this because, it's an afterthought until their children are taken away or until this child has nobody anymore and things like that. So it's just it's made me think of like what does my role and my um our family resource center play in our community so that we're not having so many children in these situations, and how are we not that last stop kind of last minute, last ditch attempt to, keep families together. How can we change that perspective so then people aren't thinking of it as, this is my last attempt, instead of like, how can I keep my family together? Because that's actually what when we were doing the power part, what does power look like? And that's for me, it was like, okay, so the families are holding that power together. They are the ones building it. And, maybe the agencies or other supports are like the cement keeping them together. So
Yeah. Yeah, so you're making me think of a couple things you might find interesting to think about in your project. And I would say do this with your colleagues, right? Do think of it organizationally and collectively rather than just individually. The first thing that occurs to me, a lot of it comes from Greg Boyle's work at Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles. But he calls it the power of encounter. I like that you have mixed groups in your parent groups, people who it sounds like might be kinship carers, and at the same time you have people there who have their children in care and may not get them back. The opportunity in being the convener and facilitator of those groups is the power of the encounter between people. It isn't in getting people to do their list. It's the power of the encounter itself. And the reason why I think that's important is you look at Boyle's work, and I think of an example of maybe more practically in some work I did. Um, I'd work with actively homeless former youth in care, large numbers of them all at the same time because of their situation. And by the time I meet them, they're decades into separation from their parents and their siblings, from their hometown. They've been trafficked, often have struggled with addiction. About half of them are parents who've already lost their children to the system. And you're meeting them individually. They're living unhoused, in incredibly precarious circumstances and really endangered. And the first question you have to struggle with in working with an individual in that context is how do you find how do we get to safety? If we got to start with something, we're gonna have to start with some kind of safety. And that safety can't be done alone. It has to be done collectively. And but the safety, the step from where they're at to their families, back to their communities, back to their culture is too big of a step. They can't even imagine it. They cannot imagine that. You have to ask yourself, what does the drugs do for them? What does the risk-taking behavior do for them? And it becomes a way of living, a way of surviving. It has a purpose, and you got to, and that's not safe. And you've got to get from there back to safety. And the first level of safety is not back to your family, it's back to people who can at least relate to what you're going through. And I see that in your parent group. Your parent group is a community that operates around the power of encounter as a place of safety. And from that place of safety, people can individually begin a process of figuring out what recovery for them means. And it'll look different, but they can collectively support each other, right? So I like to think about that's how I'm imagining you. I'm imagining your organization, this convener, this place where you bring people in situations that most of us would never want to be in. Um, and the goal of it is to create a community of safety in the group. And from that place of safety, people can begin to take small steps towards recovery, which could be keeping your appointments, attending to your parenting class. It could be small steps, but that's not what it really is. It isn't about whether you think you need to be in your parenting class or not. The question is, what do you need to do to build the life that you want to live with your kids, or the life you're going to have to live without them? Because you matter. And this group you're in with me is a place of safety to do that from. That's what we are. Does that make sense, Maria? And that then tells you who you are. And as I'll just finish with a quote again from Father Boyle. He says, stop trying to engage them, let them engage you. And then the other thing he says is show up, hold up your mirror, and tell your truth. You're perfect just the way you are. And you're welcome in this group, whether you take your class or you don't. I think you don't need to be responsible for the parenting class. They are, and their social worker is. You're responsible for the community that you're fostering. Make it a place where people can restore themselves and not have to do it alone. Hopefully that's helpful to think about. And it would be helpful to write about for your next grant. Otherwise, it gets very extractive, very about delivering things, very about nothing but process. Make it about people, not process. Whether you get your kids back or not, you can keep coming to my class. you can keep being a part of your community.
I think there's a sometimes an unsaid um, piece of all this. You know, we've spent time with you all, versions of this group and beyond, over the last couple of months, and I think sometimes it gets left unsaid that we're exploring all these things together, and we often get asked, but what's step one? What's step three? What's step five? And so I'm just thinking about your comment about writing of grants, Kevin, and making sure it's not extractive or transactional. And I'll add a third one, which is step by step. It shouldn't be. I loved what Carla wrote in the chat about what's good for our souls rather than what I'm supposed to be doing, step one, two, three. And so I guess maybe one of the things we leave you with today, not as a goodbye, just as a something to hang on to, is the reason that you feel like that is because that's how it's been presented and that's how we think of it too. It can't be every time I meet a family, if you're a direct practice person, I'm going to do this and then this and then this. Megan, for you in your role, every time I'm making a decision about blank, I'm going to do this and then this and this and this. Instead, the intention is to be thinking together and hold space and community together the same way we hope to facilitate for families we work with. And all these very practical kind of operationalized versions of things like aligning or positioning or finding or facilitating or catalyzing have tools. And the intention of this time, at least in part, is that you have a whole bunch of tools in your tool belt. Not because you're going to use them all every time, not because you'll be wrong if you do formulation before mindful positioning or after, but because you will encounter situations in courtrooms and community events and family mediation practices and grant writing processes with teammates and whatever else each of you may do. And you can then look at that tool belt and say, oh, you know what? I think we should do some alignment together. And hey, great news. I've got a way that maybe we can try that. Can everybody give me your number? How 0 to 10, Megan, this grant that you just wrote, how confident are you that what we've written is going to get us a win for this grant? If it's a 0, okay, let's figure out what's going on. 0 to 10, everybody in this room, we're working on a reunification for this child. Do you believe it's going to happen? And if not, why not? Are you committed to it? If not, why not? Let's come together around that. Oh, actually, this family is ready to gather and are just looking for a way to do that. Fantastic. Maybe we can facilitate some space and get some big paper and do a mindful positioning. My point is, if you find yourself, as I'm a little bit rigid sometimes in my practice thinking, and so I've always liked a step 1, 2, 3, right? I do really well with IKEA furniture. This is not IKEA furniture. This is work with people. And so have the big bag of tools and techniques and practices and thinking and this community to work it out with. And if we've given you any sense of that, and I certainly, for me, have been really grateful to be welcomed into what you have, then we've done enough. And that's, I don't know if that's helpful, but I always come back to that. What do I do first? How will I kind of maintain the structure? Don't.
Yeah, I think I'll just finish with this. Megan, from your sharing, but more broadly, but I have a colleague in Canada who would write me from time to time and had challenging questions she was working out, and she at some point she wanted me to know that she had made a decision to adopt a little boy internationally who had been abandoned in a hospital and had been in the hospital for 6 years because he had nowhere to go. So his first 6 years of life, he's in a hospital. He has some health problems and he has some disability. and she is Canadian, and she's made a decision that she's going to adopt him and bring him to Canada to be with her. But she's working out her ethical dilemmas and the moral questions it raises for her. And she's using me as a sounding board a little bit in that. And she knows I'm very cautious about adoptions because they almost anywhere you look into adoptions, you'll find a degree of corruption. And so you're always it's a very fraught area of practice. And I think but what she ultimately what I want to share with you is what I finally had said to her because I had to find a way to be more clear than I had been. And in the simplest terms, as complex as I made that sound, the struggle I realized for each of us is there's this world that we want to live in, and there's this world that we live in, and we struggle with both things. We're always working through our service to be a part of making the world we hope to be able to live in. And at the same time, every day, we have to make sense of the one we got. And I think adoptions bring that up. There's a world I want to live in where the mother would have gotten what she needed and not been in that position, but that is not the world she, her son, or myself lived in or live in now. Both, how can I work for that world? And also, how do I live in the one I've got? And I think we can relate to that as practitioners too. There's the world we want to practice in, and there's the world we're practicing in. How do we carry both things? And our message clearly is there's more that you can do than you may realize. And it's local. It's not somewhere else.
Well, and I just to jump in and as a final word of appreciation, I think what I've taken from this is it's like you've given us a new lens with which to see the work, a new filter through which we can approach our work with families in a different way, in a more holistic way, and in a more humane way, and trying to see things just from a different perspective. So just really appreciate the time you've spent with us preparing for this and in person, Kevin, last month, and these two virtual sessions with both you and Liz has been really a privilege and a pleasure. So thank you so much. And just a note to everybody before you leave, we do have to gather evaluations. So I'm dropping a link in the chat. If you could click on that and open that up and take a couple minutes before you move on with the rest of your day to give us some feedback. We would just really appreciate that for our own purposes as we continue to plan what we hope are thoughtful and helpful trainings in the future. So just a huge thank you to both of you. Really so grateful on a professional and personal level. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
To all of you and you, Megan, especially, but all of you, thank you from us. And we look forward to hearing from each of you at any point in the next 100 or so years.
Yes.
Please.
Well, and hopefully this
email, write to us, call us, ask questions.
Yeah, and I don't imagine this will be the last time that we'll be in touch, and we'd love to have you back again.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.